Hello and welcome back. I'm so glad you're joining me tonight. As always, grab your favorite blanket, get comfortable, and let your mind wander into the shadows. Let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear how far this little tale is traveling. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a night of chilling tales. The night had a quiet stillness, almost as if the world outside was holding its breath. For Anna, it was the kind of calm she craved. After weeks of running around, juggling work and the stresses of city life, she had finally found the time to escape. Her destination? Silent Manor, a secluded estate she had inherited from a distant relative. Anna had always been close to her family, but this particular relative, her great-aunt, Marguerite, had been a mystery. Marguerite was known for her eccentricity, often retreating to her sprawling manor in the countryside, never really speaking much about it. When the lawyer had contacted Anna with the news of her inheritance, it was almost too good to be true. A quiet getaway, a place to unwind and breathe. The timing felt perfect. The manor stood proudly at the edge of a small village, surrounded by dense woods. Its tall stone walls loomed over the landscape like an old sentinel, guarding its secrets. As Anna drove through the long, winding road leading up to the house, the ancient trees whispered in the wind, their shadows stretching like long fingers across the path. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement mixed with curiosity. Arriving at the gates, she took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The crisp night air greeted her, carrying the scent of pine and earth. She felt an odd sense of peace here, something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. The house was everything she imagined. Grand yet weathered, with ivy climbing its stone facade and a few flickering lights casting shadows from the inside. It was the perfect place for a retreat. Anna unlocked the door, stepping inside with a sense of awe. The large foyer was lined with tall windows that allowed the soft moonlight to spill in, casting a silvery glow over the worn wooden floors. The house was filled with the scent of dust and old wood, but there was something else, a subtle, lingering scent of lavender. It reminded her of her grandmother's old perfume. It was comforting, yet somehow unsettling. It was the perfume she had remembered when she was a little girl, listening to her mother reading to her while she climbed into bed. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to the long hours of travel and the unfamiliarity of the space. There was no one here, just her and the house. It was exactly what she needed, solitude. Anna explored the manor, admiring the old paintings hanging on the walls, the antique furniture that looked like it had been passed down through generations. She found a small study off to the side, its shelves stacked high with books, some of which were so old they looked as though they had never been touched. She made a mental note to spend time there the next day, but for now, she was content to just breathe in the stillness of the manor. As the evening grew later, Anna decided to settle into her room. The soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound breaking the silence. She pulled back the heavy curtains to let in more of the moonlight and took a moment to admire the view. Dense woods stretching out into the distance, the occasional glint of an animal's eyes reflecting in the darkness. There was something eerily peaceful about the view. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, a dark sea of trees that felt as though they were hiding something, but Anna wasn't sure what. It didn't matter, she told herself. She was here to escape the chaos, not to dive into mysteries. As she lay in bed, she felt her body finally relax, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. She was just turning towards sleep when the shadows began to move and started to tremble. But then, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it. A faint noise, almost imperceptible at first. A soft, deliberate creaking, the kind of sound that could easily be dismissed as the house settling. But it was different. The sound was too rhythmic, almost as if it were someone walking slowly across the floor above her. Miranda woke slowly, but she moved toward the sound, looking for what it came from without bothering to listen. Her heart skipped a beat. Anna sat up, her mind racing. There was no one else in the house. She had checked when she arrived. The creaking continued, followed by a faint shuffling noise, as though someone was dragging their feet across the floor. Anna felt her throat tighten, her pulse quickening. The house was old, yes, and maybe the wood was just settling, but the sound felt too deliberate, too intentional. She lay back down, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. It was nothing, she told herself, just her imagination playing tricks in the quiet of the night. She pulled the covers tighter around her, willing herself to relax. But the noise persisted, faint but undeniable, and this time, Anna wasn't sure if she could ignore it. The following morning, the Anna woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains. The strange noises from the night before seemed like a distant memory, clouded by the warmth of sleep. The manor was still, as it had been the night before, and the only sound was the faint chirping of birds outside. She stretched, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The bed was comfortable, and for the first time in weeks her mind was at ease. There was no rushing to get anywhere, no deadlines, no distractions. Just the promise of quiet days ahead and the allure of the house itself. She hadn't even fully explored yet, and there was something exciting about that. Anna stood and walked over to the window, pushing the curtains aside. The view of the woods was beautiful in the early morning light, the trees bathed in a soft, golden glow. The air felt fresh, almost like it was inviting her to explore further. She smiled to herself, already planning a walk through the grounds after breakfast. But as she turned away from the window, something caught her eye. Just a flicker, really, but enough to make her pause. A shadow. It was quick, almost imperceptible, moving along the wall outside her door. Anna's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the spot where the shadow had been, but there was nothing now. The hallway was empty, as it should be. She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe it had been a trick of the light or just her mind playing games after the unsettling sounds of the night before. Still, she couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine. Breakfast was simple. A fresh loaf of bread, butter, and a pot of tea she had found in the kitchen. It was peaceful, quiet, and as she sat at the old wooden table, Anna felt her thoughts begin to clear. She didn't need to rush into exploring today. The house was vast, and she had all the time in the world. And after breakfast, she decided to take a walk through the grounds, hoping the fresh air would help clear her mind. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the temperature was cool but not unpleasant. She followed the path leading through the garden, past a small stone fountain, its water barely making a sound as it trickled over the stones. The scent of lavender from the garden filled the air, and she couldn't help but take a deep breath, appreciating the tranquility. As she walked, Anna couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was. The birds were silent now, and the wind had died down. It felt like the world had gone still, as if it were waiting for something. The path led her to the edge of the woods, where the trees grew thick and dense. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the pull of the dark forest before her. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just the silence, though that was unsettling in its own right. There was a presence in the woods, something she couldn't quite place, a heaviness in the air, as if the trees themselves were watching her. Anna took a step forward, her feet crunching softly on the gravel path. The further she walked, the more the trees seemed to close in around her, their branches arching over her head like dark fingers. The air grew colder, and a chill ran down her spine. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own footsteps, the occasional rustling of leaves, and something else, a low hum, distant and faint like the murmur of voices just out of reach. She stopped and looked around, her heart beating faster now. The sound was gone, as quickly as it had appeared. She shook her head again, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. The manor had been abandoned for so long after all, it was likely that the woods were full of strange noises, things that could easily be explained away. But as she turned to head back to the house, she noticed something on the ground, a small, dark object lying in the gravel. Anna bent down to pick it up, her fingers brushing against something smooth and cold. It was a stone, small and round, with strange markings carved into its surface. She turned it over in her hand, trying to make sense of the symbols, but they were unlike anything she had ever seen before. A shiver ran down her spine as she stared at the stone, an inexplicable sense of unease washing over her. She didn't know why, but she felt an odd pull to it, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. Without thinking, she slipped the stone into her pocket and turned back toward the house, her steps quickening. The manor was just as she had left it, quiet and still. She entered through the back door and made her way to the kitchen, the stone still in her pocket, its presence now an undeniable weight against her side. It was ridiculous, she told herself. It was just a stone, a strange but harmless stone. Still, the sense of unease lingered, and as she placed the stone on the kitchen counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Whatever. The stone sat on the kitchen counter, its smooth surface reflecting the dim light of the room. Anna couldn't help but glance at it every few seconds, her curiosity piqued by the strange markings etched into it. It seemed ordinary enough, but there was something about it that felt wrong. A sense of unease settled in her chest, a feeling she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it. She tried to focus on other things, unpacking her things, organizing the kitchen, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the stone. It was as if it were calling to her, urging her to understand it, to unlock whatever secret it held. But Anna didn't know where to begin. She had no idea what the symbols meant, or if they meant anything at all. A faint sound from upstairs broke her concentration. It was a soft creak, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Her heart skipped a beat. The manor had been silent since she arrived, and the only people in the house were her and the occasional caretaker who had left for the day. Anna stood still for a moment, listening intently. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable. They echoed down the hallway, each step growing louder, closer. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively reached for the stone on the counter, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. The sensation was strangely comforting, but it did nothing to ease the tension building in her chest. The footsteps continued, now right outside the kitchen door. Anna held her breath, waiting. A shadow moved across the threshold, casting a fleeting shape on the floor, but no one entered. The air in the room grew heavy, and for a moment she wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. Perhaps it was the house settling, or the wind moving through the old wood. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. Anna stood frozen, her mind racing. She had to investigate. Slowly, she made her way toward the door, her pulse quickening with each step. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and the hall leading to the stairs was long and narrow. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt a cold draft rush past her, as if something, or someone, had just moved through the space. She stared at the stark black door with trepidation, and the house was unnervingly quiet again, but the air felt different, heavier. Anna hesitated at the base of the stairs, her hand resting on the railing. The footsteps hadn't been a figment of her imagination. She was sure of it now. Someone, or something, was in the house with her. Taking a deep breath, she slowly ascended the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. She paused at the top, looking down the long corridor. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out from within. Hannah's heart skipped. The room was empty, as it had been when she first arrived. She had made sure of it. But now there was something different. The door was ajar, just enough to make it seem as though someone had recently entered. She pushed the door open further, stepping into the room. The air inside was thick, as though it had been undisturbed for years. The bed was neatly made, the furniture undisturbed, but a faint, musty odor lingered in the air. Anna glanced around, her eyes drawn to the corner of the room, where a small wooden chest sat. It was old, weathered, its surface scratched and chipped with age. Anna's curiosity got the better of her. She crossed the room and knelt in front of the chest, her fingers brushing over the lock. It was cold to the touch, and the sensation sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated for a moment, but then, as if driven by some unseen force, she reached for the lock and twisted it open. Lock closed them. Inside there was only darkness. No light, no sign of what had been stored there. But as she peered into the chest, her eyes caught something glimmering at the bottom. Something small and round. The stone from the garden. The one she had found earlier that day. It was now lying at the bottom of the chest, as if it had always belonged there. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't put it in the chest. She hadn't even been near this room. How had it gotten there? Her hand trembled as she reached for the stone, its smooth surface cool against her fingertips. As soon as she touched it, a sudden rush of images flooded her mind. Flashes of a time long past, of people she didn't recognize, of faces twisted in terror. A woman, her face contorted in pain, a child staring out into the darkness, and then a shadow, a figure standing just beyond the edge of her vision. Anna stumbled back, the stone falling from her grasp and clattering to the floor. She could still feel the presence, the weight of it pressing in on her, like something was standing just behind her, watching. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was nothing there, of course. Just the same empty room, the same eerie stillness. But the sensation lingered. It clung to her, refusing to let go. Anna grabbed the stone and hurried out of the room, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Something was not right in this house, and it was only a matter of time before she uncovered whatever it was. Serana. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It clung to her like a second skin as she made her way down the darkened hallway. The stone felt unnaturally heavy in her palm, its surface cool and unyielding. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Anna. The silence of the house was deafening. It seemed to press in on her from all sides, the walls thick with the weight of years of history. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet made her jump. Every rustle of the curtains seemed to whisper her name. But it wasn't the house itself that frightened her. It was the stone, the images, the voices, the strange connection it had to this place. Anna glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But there was nothing. Just the same empty hallway, the same distant sound of wind whispering through the trees outside. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed answers. Her eyes fell on the study at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had left it open on purpose. The faint glow of a lamp flickered from within, casting shadows on the walls. Anna felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The stone seemed to hum in her hand, as if urging her forward. Down, back, past it, she thought softly, as if urging her forward. Now. Without thinking, she moved toward the study, her footsteps soft against the old wood. As she reached for the door, she heard it, the faintest sound, like a breath, a whisper, barely audible. as if someone had spoken her name. Anna froze. She turned, but again there was nothing. No one. Just the stillness of the house. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She had to stop doing this, letting her fear take control. She had to face whatever was in this house, whatever had drawn her here. With a shaky breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the study. The room was lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty old volumes, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. A large desk sat in the center of the room, papers scattered across its surface. But what caught Anna's attention was the large portrait hanging on the far wall. It was a painting of a man, a tall, imposing figure, his eyes dark and cold. His expression was stern, almost unforgiving, and his gaze seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. The portrait was old, the edges of the frame worn and chipped, but there was something about it that made her skin crawl. Anna approached the painting, her fingers grazing the edge of the frame. As she did, the stone in her hand pulsed once, sending a sharp jolt of energy through her body. She gasped, dropping it onto the desk with a soft clink. The stone rolled slightly, stopping at the edge of a stack of papers. She bent down to retrieve it, but something stopped her. A single piece of paper caught her eye, its edges yellowed and brittle. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the desk. The handwriting was faded but legible. The stone is the key. It remembers what we've forgotten. It calls to those who seek the truth. Beware, for the past never truly dies. Anna's heart raced as she read the words, her mind racing to make sense of them. The stone, the key, the past. It all felt connected somehow, but she couldn't understand how. Who had written this? And why did it feel like the warning was meant for her? His father raised an eyebrow. And why did it feel like the warning was meant for her? She glanced at the stone again, still lying on the desk. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with an electric tension. The faint whispering sound had returned, this time louder, clearer. It was coming from the painting. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the portrait, the man, was no longer staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. No, now his expression was one of quiet sorrow, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he was pleading with her to understand. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer. You shouldn't have come. The stone has chosen you. Anna stumbled back, her pulse quickening. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around her. The stone seemed to glow faintly, a strange, otherworldly light pulsing from within its depths. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this room, away from the painting, away from the stone. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Anna's heart stopped. She spun around, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. She was trapped. Dislocked? And then, just as suddenly as the silence had returned, the whispering stopped. The stone on the desk flickered once more, and then nothing. Anna pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The stone had brought her here. The painting. The words. It was all part of something she couldn't understand. But there was one thing she knew for certain. The house wasn't empty. And whatever was inside it had no intention of letting her leave. Anna's breath was shallow, her pulse racing in her ears. She pressed harder against the door, but it didn't budge. The stone on the desk had begun to pulse again, sending waves of energy through the room. The flickering light cast strange, elongated shadows across the walls, and the whispering that had stopped only moments ago returned. Louder now, as though the very walls were speaking. You shouldn't have come. You're the one who was chosen. The past will claim you. Anna's mind swirled with confusion. Her heart pounded so violently that she could hear it in her throat. The whispers, the stone, the eerie portrait, all of it felt like a nightmare, something she couldn't escape from no matter how hard she tried. She tried to rationalize it. She had to. This couldn't be real. It had to be some trick of the mind. But then she remembered the words on the paper. The warning. The stone was the key. It had called to her, and now it was dragging her deeper into something she didn't understand. The stone, it remembers. The whisper was closer now, almost as if it was right next to her ear. Anna spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing, just the same oppressive stillness, the same dark shadows creeping across the room. Then the whisper stopped. The stone was glowing more brightly now, its pulse matching the rhythm of her heart. Anna's hand reached out on its own accord, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above it. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to get any closer to whatever power it held. But something was drawing her to it, compelling her to understand, to unlock whatever it was hiding. With a deep breath, she forced herself to pick it up. The moment her fingers closed around the cold stone, a shock of energy coursed through her, and the room seemed to shift. The walls around her blurred, and for a brief moment the study was no longer just a room. It was something else, something ancient. She could see flashes of images, faces twisted in anguish. The man from the painting staring down at her, his eyes now full of sorrow. The whispers grew louder. No longer just a voice, but a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words blending together in a maddening rush. Anna staggered back, clutching the stone tightly, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. You've opened the door. The past is alive. It's coming for you. The air grew colder, the temperature in the room dropping rapidly. She could see her breath, small puffs of vapor forming in the frigid air. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch toward her, creeping along the floor and up the furniture, like dark tendrils of smoke. She had to get out. She had to escape. For the past 12 years, she'd been trying to be... But the stone, it felt heavier now, as though it were pulling her deeper into its power. Her legs shook, and the room seemed to spin around her. She felt like she was drowning, sinking into a void, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She dropped to her knees, the stone slipping from her hand and rolling across the floor, coming to rest against the edge of the desk. It's too late now. The voice whispered again, this time clearer, more distinct. Anna turned. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the man from the painting step out from the shadows. His tall, imposing figure was no longer confined to the canvas. He was standing right in front of her, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of sorrow and rage. "You should never have come," he said, his voice low and echoing, as though it came from all directions at once. "You were never meant to know." Anna scrambled backward, her hands pushing against the cold wooden floor. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, the air suffocating. The man stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, as if the room itself were closing in on her. His eyes burned with a fierce intensity, and she felt an icy chill settle in her bones. "The stone is mine," he growled. "It was never meant for you." She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy. The man reached out a hand, his fingers cold and long, as though he were trying to pull her into the darkness that surrounded them. She could feel his power, ancient and relentless, reaching for her, suffocating her.
"It's a..."
And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. Stopped. The room went still. The whispers ceased. The man was gone. Anna lay there, gasping for breath, her body trembling. The stone had stopped glowing. The room was just a room again, silent, dark, and empty. She slowly pushed herself up, her eyes darting around, expecting the man to appear again. But there was nothing. It was over. For now. But she knew deep down that it wasn't over. The stone had chosen her, and the past had awakened, and it was far from done with her. Anna sat on the cold floor of the study, her heart still racing, her breath shallow. The silence in the room was oppressive, the weight of the stone's lingering presence pressing down on her. Her mind was reeling, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The man, the whispers, the ancient power of the stone, it all felt like a dream, but it was too vivid, too real. She slowly rose to her feet, her legs weak beneath her. Her fingers brushed against the stone, still cold, but no longer pulsing with that eerie energy. It lay there, silent, waiting. Anna hesitated. She didn't know what to do. She had touched the stone, and now it felt like it had claimed her. The room seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, as if something was watching her, waiting for her next move. "It's not over," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't the deep, menacing tone of the man. It was softer, almost comforting, like a distant memory. "You have a choice." Her hand trembled as she reached for the stone, the words echoing in her mind. A choice? What choice? The stone had already chosen her. She could feel it in her bones, the connection to something ancient, something powerful. But could she break free from it? With a deep breath, Anna gripped the stone tightly. She closed her eyes and concentrated, trying to focus her thoughts, trying to quiet the whirlwind in her mind. She could feel the whispers growing louder, but this time she wasn't afraid. She was determined. The stone was silent, and the air around her grew heavy, like a storm was about to break. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, but she stood her ground, holding the stone firmly. "Let go," the voice urged, soft and pleading. Anna opened her eyes, staring down at the stone in her hand. She had felt its power, its pull, but she also felt something else, something deeper. It wasn't just fear or darkness that the stone held. There was something else hidden within it. A part of her, perhaps, that she hadn't seen before. A strength she hadn't known she had. She closed her eyes again and took a deep breath. The stone pulsed in her hand, but this time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. She could feel the weight of history, of all the souls that had touched it before her, all the choices that had been made. And now, it was her turn. Let go. Anna slowly released her grip on the stone. It rolled from her hand and came to rest on the floor, silent and still. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was still. The whispers faded into nothing. And then the door to the study creaked open. Anna's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound. The doorway was framed in soft, warm light, as though the darkness had been lifted, if only for a moment. She walked toward it, each step tentative but resolute. She glanced back at the stone, but it no longer seemed important. Whatever had happened in this room, whatever had been unleashed, was over. As she crossed the threshold, she stepped into the light, leaving the study and the weight of the past behind. Outside, the world was calm. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. Anna stood there for a long moment, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the weight of the stone's power finally lift from her shoulders. She had been chosen, but now she had made her choice. She had let go, and in that moment, she felt free.